Welcome to the Otherweb. Our guest today is Jeff Jarvis, a journalism professor at the City College in New York, the author of 6 books, and the co-host of the successful podcast This Week in Google and AI. Jeff spent many years teaching entrepreneurial journalism, and God knows journalism could use some entrepreneurial spirit right about now. Professor Jarvis, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Alex. Glad to be here.
So it seems like you've been in the world of media for longer than I've been alive.
Make me feel old, Alex. Thanks. A great way to start. Great way to start.
I mean this in the sense that you've seen a few cycles and you know what things tend to look like. And it seems like right now we're on a bit of a down cycle, I would say. 42% of American adults are avoiding the news. Trust in media is at an all-time low. What do you think is going wrong?
I'm not sure, the honest answer. I think that we are at a point of inflection and change, and we haven't figured it out yet. I wrote a book called The Gutenberg Parenthesis, in which I look back at the history of print until today. And one of the great lessons from my research there is how long it took before I think society got a sense of print. When print started, it was not seen as credible at all because who could make this thing? The same as today. Who could make a tweet or a Facebook post? The first 50 years of print, called the incunabular or infant phase, were all about imitating the scribes. And it wasn't until 50 years later that the book took on the form that we now know with titles and title pages and page numbers and paragraph indentations and such. Also, 50 years after the invention of print or movable type. I should say, by the way, that movable type was also used in Korea and China before Gutenberg, but 50 years after Gutenberg, the business was in shambles. Too much money had flooded in. The market was saturated. It was rescued by Martin Luther and by the controversy that came. But what's more telling to me is that it was not until another century later, a few years this side and that of 1600, before we saw a huge rush of innovation with print. The invention of the modern novel with Cervantes, the essay with Montaigne, a market for printed plays with Shakespeare, and the newspaper. And so I think we're in the very early days of figuring out what the hell the internet is, and we still see the future in the analog of the past. And so much of the discussion that occurs is about trying to preserve things the way they were. This is what is happening as publishers are going to court and going to Congress to try to extend copyright and shrink fair use for their benefit. They're trying to get protectionist legislation to preserve their old business models. And meanwhile, the public has moved on. And I don't think we've yet created the new institutions, maybe you're creating one of them, that can help people sift through what is a lot more chaff to find what is also more wheat.
Right, so I'm really interested to dig into that last part, but let's talk about the printing press for a second. Because you mentioned that it took a while just to get the technology right and for people to know what to do with it. But when I look at the history outside of the printing business, it looks like we have witch hunts and inquisitions and 52 religious wars all over Europe. So it had an effect, even though people didn't quite figure out how to do it properly yet.
Oh, absolutely. And I don't think there was necessarily a definition of properly. This is one of the things that interests me about the discussion of AI and models and guardrails and such. AI is a general machine, like the printing press was a general machine, and it can be made to do anything. And I don't think that guardrails will work. I quite adore the work of Elizabeth Eisenstein, who's the kind of the founder of the field of book history. And she was quick to point out in her seminal work, The Printing Press as an Agent of Change, that printing press, yes, led to or made possible the Enlightenment, but it also made possible witch hunts. The printing press was used for both. And one of my favorite stories from the early days, since you're staying on the early days for another minute, is Niccolo Perotti, who was a bishop and Latin grammarian in Italy in the year 1470, was said to have made the first call for censorship of print. He wrote to the Pope. He was offended by a shoddy translation of Pliny. And he wrote to the Pope and said something must be done, sound familiar, and proposed that the Pope had to appoint a censor, a reasonably learned man, to review and approve all the things that came off the press before they did, which first obviously betrays a lack of understanding of the scale of print that would follow. But second, I disagreed that this was a call for censorship. Instead, what I think Perotti was doing was anticipating and wishing for the establishment of the institutions of publishing and editing that would assure, to a great extent, quality and authority and credibility and artistry in publishing for 500 years to follow. Those institutions are inadequate to the scale of speech today and the circumstances of speech. And so I think we need to come up with new institutions, and we haven't yet begun to invent them.
So it sounds pretty similar to today's fight against misinformation, with certain departments of the FBI in San Francisco sending takedown requests to Twitter.
Yeah, and I think that the first reflex, whenever there's an increase in speech, one thing I learned in doing the research is that the first reflex is to try to control. Oh my God, terrible things can be said. Something must be done. We must get our hands on this. So that leads to the Catholic Church with its index of prohibited books. It leads to the FCC trying to control radio. It leads to all the regulation now coming about the internet, and to the same discussion now occurring around AI. But that's a fool's errand. You're never going to get rid of all the crap, because humans like to put out crap, and that's never going to end. The far more fruitful task is not to get rid of the bad stuff, but to find the good stuff. And that's where I think we're only just beginning to turn our attention online.
Right, so I remember Jonathan Rauch's Constitution of Knowledge that was talking about the social process of trying to get the good stuff to bubble up to the top, essentially. The architecture we had after the Enlightenment. That's obviously insufficient now. Do you see something today that we can do that is similar, or do we have to wait 200 years for it to evolve?
It's the right question, and I'm too damned old, as you pointed out at the beginning, to know where this is going to turn out. I think some institutions can be adapted for this different world. I think libraries are very adaptable and are working to adapt themselves. If you look at, Rutgers University has combined journalism and library science and digital into one program or one school. Book publishing, I think, is fairly secure. That's one lesson I had. I wrote a book. My first book was called What Would Google Do? And in it, I argued that books needed to be updated and linkable and clickable and arguable and searchable. And that I said we were too in love with books to change them, and that was a problem. In the Gutenberg parenthesis, I recant that. And I say, no, that the book, I think, has proven itself in history as the institution to judge against. On the other hand, I think newspapers and magazines, certainly in print, are doomed, completely doomed. And I think trying to just replicate them online is also foolhardy. I started the magazine Entertainment Weekly, and may it rest in peace. It's no longer in print. It had its time. Magazines had their time. They had their role. And I was thinking about this for an afterword in an academic book that I'm working on now, that maybe the difference is advertising. Maybe what happened was that book publishers continued to sell their books while magazine and newspaper publishers sold the audience instead. And I wrote a little book called Magazine, in which I mark the beginning of all of this, the attention economy, in 1893, when a guy named Frank Munsey started a magazine, or had a magazine called Munsey's. He was selling it for 25 to 35 cents. It wasn't working very well. He decided he was going to sell it for a dime. Thus, he lost money on every copy. How did he make money? Advertising. There is the beginning of the attention economy. There is the beginning of mass media and the business model behind it. And I think that's what's dying now. And so what the economic support for creativity and discourse will be, I don't know.
Well, it's essentially dying now by accelerating the worst parts of what it did, the special read all about it, but now applied to every single article.
Absolutely. I mean, I when the New York Times bought about.com many years ago, they hired me to consult to try to make it more editorial. And I was fascinated by About, because About, if you'll remember, basically competed with Wikipedia as a commercial entity. They answered the questions people had. And if they didn't have the answer, they saw people were asking it, they then wrote the answer. They found out what people were asking because of the referral from Google. They got most of their traffic from Google. They got more than half their ad revenue from Google. Now, in any other world, Google would have said, screw you, we're going to own this. But Google realized that to scale, no, it was better off if others invested and others started things and Google benefited. However, there was no barrier to entry. And so along came all these cheap, crappy, horrible content factories. And they gummed up the works so that Google's first major search update, called Panda, was about demoting all of those things, including About.com. Same with BuzzFeed. They invented this whole structure of virality in social media. Then they made a lot of money at the beginning doing that, but then there was no barrier to entry. So others did the same thing. They ruined it for everybody. And, I think about it now, Alex, the people are accusing Google of having become worse, and I think it may be true, but I'm not sure whether the fault lies in Google or in the web. The web is a mess. And who made it a mess? Well, it started with media making it a mess, with expecting everybody to come to us, with doing clickbait, with copying everybody else. I think media really screwed up the web, and I'm not sure how fixable it is. I think it is. I have another book, I'm sorry for all the plugs here, but I have another book coming out in the fall called The Web We Weave, in which I do hold out hope, because I think the internet is so important. Without the internet, we wouldn't have survived the pandemic as well as we did. The internet has let me hear all kinds of voices I never would have heard before that were always there. I love what the internet presents, but we have to protect it and fight for it.
Yeah, as an engineer, I would say the internet has a lot of signal, but the signal to noise ratio is very low. And
absolutely
makes it hard to find stuff.
Well, and the other problem is, I learned this after 2016 when Google and Facebook each called a whole bunch of us saying, well, what do we do after the Trump election and Brexit? And Google made clear to me that signals have a half-life before they get exploited by people. And so no signal, right, is good forever.
Let me ask you a question, since you've been involved in this, and I've been pondering this for a bit. So Google is saying the right things here, thinking about the signal, what half-life it has, how to get the right information to people. But it seems like their financial incentives are actually not really aligned with getting the best information to people, because they have this giant moat. They pay something like $40 billion per year to maintain that moat by buying off everybody to make Google the default search engine, right? And in that situation now, what is their incentive to bring you the best information as opposed to just making you click on more stuff and see more ads?
I think the incentive is the crappier the experience and value at Google, the crappier the future is for Google. I think that, people mock "don't be evil" as a motto for Google, but I heard Eric Schmidt explain more than once, and the founders explain, that it wasn't the equivalent of AI boys saying that they're going to be the next gods. It was instead them giving permission to their employees to stop them from doing something that was going to have them hurt the business by hurting the service. And I think that's the way it was, at least certainly in many years in the beginning, is that Google has a market pressure. A lot of young people use TikTok search engine now. We can joke about Bing, but it is out there. Amazon is used as a search for all kinds of things, for products and such. And now comes AI. I think Google has to protect the experience at Google. That if we go there and don't get answers, then we're in problems. Now, obviously, the next thing that's happening, and this I'm sure is affecting your business strategy, is when we get AI answers to questions directly, as Google's been doing with knowledge boxes and such for some time now, then the destination strategy for media starts to fall apart, and media scream, and media go to legislators to get regulation and such. But again, media screwed this up. And by media now, I mean everybody. The example is, if you want to find out how to fix your printer, how to get it on Wi-Fi, because it's too damn confusing, there'll be a YouTube video for that, surely. But you've got to sit through 15 minutes of blathering because that person is trying to extend you to go through the ads so they make more money. If Google comes up and gives me the simple answer right off the top, that's a much better experience for me. It's a worse experience for media, but tough noogies. What matters is the customer experience in the end.
Yeah, and it will soon be possible to generate a video of AI explaining to you how to do this. So even the format preference, because you can leave the video playing in the background as you're doing it, as opposed to reading a text, that will probably go away.
But given you're an engineer, let me ask you a question around that. I think it's one matter for AI to rank search results. Mm-hmm. It's another matter for generative AI to generate an answer to a question. When we know that generative AI has no sense of meaning, no sense of fact or truth. And so I think both those are AI-aided tasks,
right?
Ranking versus generation. And then the next phase is going to be agentic. But for the agent to work, you've got to trust the generation to be truthful. And if it's not truthful, and if it's not credible, I should say, then it's not going to work. I mean, I worry that putting generative AI next to search at all is a problem. Do you see that working eventually, or do you see that always being a problem of credibility when it comes to generation?
I'm going to give you an answer that's probably unpopular, and most people would not answer it this way, but I think generation is the easiest of the two steps, right? The problem is curation. Once I actually take a generative model and I give it good inputs, and I tell it, just describe it in a nice, readable way that people will enjoy and understand, it's really good at that. All the hallucinations you're seeing are basically when people are asking a generative model to come up with something from its own knowledge, and its own knowledge is based on the internet, and the internet is junk, right? And plus, the way LLMs are structured are causing drift within the answer by itself. So even if the knowledge were perfect, every word essentially assumes the previous word was correct, but the previous word already had some error in it.
And add in randomness to it as well. Yes.
Yeah, but the randomness grows with the length of the answer, essentially.
Exactly.
Right. So all that being said, if the curation were perfect, and if you only use the generative model to basically say, articulate these facts without adding anything of your own, then I think that's the easier step. The harder step is, let's say you're Google, you found a bunch of search results to the query about how to set up a printer. Now, which ones of those do you summarize? That's the harder question, because if you summarize the wrong one, then your answer is just as bad as the stuff you summarized.
Yeah, this goes back to history again, where Niccolo Perotti anticipating the institutions of editing and publishing. And then we came to the next explosion of text and speech, came with the mechanization and industrialization of print in the 19th century, with steam-powered rotary presses, with cheap paper, stereotyping, and my favorite device, the linotype, which sped up the typesetting of words. I'm writing the next book about the linotype. And at that time, the response to it was, in essence, I'm oversimplifying a bit here, but this was the cause for the invention of the genre of the magazine. Because publishers said, oh, there's so much good stuff, right? They switched from let's get rid of all the bad stuff to let's find the good stuff. And magazine publishers said, there's a market to curate, to find the good stuff and share that with people. Harper's Magazine in 1850 started with a curatorial mission saying that we are here to bring the best of this incredible new world of greater publishing to the public. Now, over time, it wanted to invent its own content and create its own brand more than that. But Gentleman's Magazine was really the first to use the word magazine. Harper's in the US did the same thing. And so my question becomes, where's the Harper's of 1850 for today? And is that Otherweb?
Well, we certainly are trying to do that. But I think there's a next step here, which is there's only so far we can get with curating what people are writing. If the people writing are going out of business left and right, and it seems like the financial pressure is such that maybe we won't have stuff to curate from anymore. That is my concern, and that is in part why we're also looking at the generative side of things, because ultimately, if AI is putting writers out of business, then we might as well make AI write well instead of letting somebody like BuzzFeed control what AI is going to write. Right? So this leads us to the next big question, which is, you said that essentially the media failed to adjust to the internet. It's still trying to figure it out. And before it figured it out, now AI is coming to the scene. And specifically, the part of AI that's becoming popular is the part that is able to write coherently. That's basically the big innovation we have now. And that's the one skill that until now the media and writers had essentially a monopoly over. Right? They could investigate and they could write. Now writing becomes no longer scarce. What's going to happen?
So in the Gutenberg parenthesis, I argue against the notion of content. That was a conceit of the print era, that content is that which fills things. And it has a beginning and an end, and it fills between the covers of a book or the pages of a magazine or newspaper. And we in media thought that our value was in manufacturing this thing called content. It wasn't, because we now see, thanks first to the internet, but also certainly more so to AI, that this content, this idea of content is completely commodified. As a writer, I'm not so special anymore. Neither are coders, right? Because the machine can do those things for us. Our value in journalism was never in making a thing called content or even in writing, except in rare cases of wonderful writers. What mattered was the information, was the reporting, was holding power to account, was listening to communities and understanding their needs and bringing authority and credibility to those needs. So I think, and as a teacher in journalism school, I think that in great measure through the years, we taught the wrong emphasis. And there'll be plenty in journalism schools who say, no, reporting is the most important thing we do, not writing. But the students often come in saying, I want to be a writer. And I started a program with my colleague, Carrie Brown, in engagement journalism, which was all about first listening to communities, understanding their needs. Now, I don't think that AI can replace reporting. However, it certainly can be helpful in collaborating with reporting. So the example, it's already a bit hackneyed that I use. I talked to the editor of a statewide publication a few months ago, and I said, you should use AI to transcribe 100 recordings of school board meetings that are recorded by citizens collaborating with you and helping. And then you can bring that into an LLM and make that queryable. I can ask questions. How many of these school districts are banning books? And so on. And so I thought this was a different role for reporters and news organizations. Well, at Google I/O about a week ago, one thing that just came by just in passing was one of the examples they used is, well, somebody could email you a recording of the school board meeting and Gemini can transcribe it and then answer questions, summarize it and answer questions about it. No need for a journalist. We still do need the journalist for a lot of purposes, but I think that we've got to get away from the commodity tasks of reporting as well. And what happens, so much of our business model is built on rewriting everybody else. That we publish the same exact story so we can have our own page with our own content to get our own clicks, to get our own SEO, to get our own ad pennies. And we're wasting journalistic resource on that kind of repetition. We have to move to a world where journalism provides unique value.
Yeah, that's one thing I certainly wasn't able to understand when I just started entering this space. Why am I searching for the name of a particular event and seeing 50 articles written by different people all within the same hour describing the same fact pattern? As an engineer, I can understand the first one, maybe two if you want the left-wing and the right-wing version. But what are the other 48 doing? Why aren't they researching something else?
Ben Smith, the former editor of BuzzFeed, wrote in his book Traffic about the famous case of the two-colored dress. Some people saw these colors, others saw those colors, right?
Yeah.
And it was the biggest traffic event for BuzzFeed in its history. And BuzzFeed did a fine job. It was a cute little story. And it got a lot of talk. Well, I used to go to journalism conferences and I would ask people, how many of your publications wrote their own versions of that story? And every hand would go up. Well, they didn't add a damn thing. It was a complete waste. But again, it's the business model of the attention economy started by Frank Munsey in 1893 that leads them to do that so they can have their own content at their own destination with their own ads. And what changes now so much, I think AI is going to fundamentally change the information ecosystem such that if AI is going to go out there as an agent and find the answer to my question or alert me to the thing that I want to be alerted to, then how does the news industry react to that? Now, right now they react by suing or by going for legislation. But I think we've got to reimagine the relationship. And what I try to tell people in the news industry is that they should be banding together to create a news API and say to the AI companies, you need fresh, credible information. We have it, and we're going to make it easy for you to have it, but here's the conditions. Here's how you get a key, right? You pay us, you credit us, you present us in a certain way, and that's just negotiation. But the news industry has never managed to work together in harmony. They always fight each other. You have Axel Springer in Germany and the Wall Street Journal and the FT all trying to grab their money out of the AI companies now, screw everybody else, which means all the small local players are going to be left out of this deal entirely because AI doesn't need, you tell me, but it doesn't need every news site to train a model. Contrast that with what's happening in the Nordics. Schibsted, which is the leading publisher of news in Norway and elsewhere in the Nordics, has a very different attitude. They got Norwegian publishers to come together to all contribute their content to the creation of a Norwegian language LLM, and they're doing the same thing with other Northern European languages. And that's for a research phase. In my podcast that I co-host called AI Inside, we interviewed Sven Størmer-Taulo, who's the CTO of Schibsted, and he said, our content, our archival content as a learning set for AI is only so valuable. It's fungible. They can find other news. But if they're going to use our news, the only fair thing is to also give us access to their technology. That's a strategic way to look at this. That's a collaborative way to look at this. That's a much better way than what's happening in US and Central Europe.
Well, I think in the US, there is a lot more redundancy. And so there's a lot more outlets writing the same content. Whereas in the Nordics, usually it is only 3 or 4 players you have to get to unite. And plus, I guess they're used to playing as a team to begin with.
Or even in the rest of Europe, they've had national brands for a long time that had to have competitive voices. The US is so damn big that before the satellite transmission of pages in the 1970s, which enabled national editions of the Wall Street Journal and USA Today, and after television killed local newspapers, you had monopolies in each market that had to present the whole world to their readers for as far as a truck or a train could go. So it was legitimate at the time that they would all have the same news. But once the link was invented, thank you, Sir Berners-Lee, that wasn't necessary anymore. And they haven't gotten out of that habit.
So let's gameplay how this could go for a little bit. It sounds like journalists are going to need to retreat more towards fact gathering because writing is commoditized, right? So they're essentially becoming really good PIs, if to kind of use colorful language there, right? AI models are beginning to do most of the writing. Probably that means more redundancy in the market rather than less, because now the cost of creating an additional article describing the same fact pattern becomes 0, right? And the time to do so becomes basically infinitesimal, right? So it doesn't take an hour to create your version of an article somebody published. It takes a second. If that is the case, who is paying for the investigative work? Because it doesn't seem like they're going to get the eyeballs. There is no advantage to being first anymore.
Good questions, which is how a professor buys time to come up with an answer. I think a few things. I think you're absolutely right about the cost of creating that article going to 0. Where we've seen that happen in the cases of Sports Illustrated, for example, where they hired a bad company, to create reviews, which is absurd because when you read a review, you want to read a human's judgment of something. But instead now the review has been completely ruined online because all of these AI companies come along because they want affiliate, not advertising, but affiliate money. So we'll recommend this pillow so that you can then order it on Amazon and we'll get our cut of it. And it costs us nothing to do that, right? So the online review is now worthless, completely, absolutely worthless. And the same thing could happen to news.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt there, but at some point we implemented our own search engine where the first option that I wanted to add was eliminate all results with affiliate links.
Which is too bad in a way, because just to stay on your detour here, I started a community of practice around commerce when I was running a center for entrepreneurial journalism because I wanted publishers to have one more revenue stream and discipline besides just circulation and instead of to say subscription and ad sales. And it was working for publishers. BuzzFeed was doing a good job of that. They started a whole food brand around this. I convinced a newspaper publisher to do this, and within a year they had a $2 million revenue stream. And affiliate links were a new way to support news that was actually going to be good, but this is why we can't have nice things. Everything gets ruined. So back to your question about reporting. I think on the investigative side, I'm a little confident about that because I think that there is unique value there, that the Washington Post and the New York Times invest in that, and people know that they're going to do things and they're going to break stories. And that's fine. If you look at the digital outlet called Lookout Santa Cruz in California, started by Ken Doctor, it just won a Pulitzer because they did excellent work in a weather disaster in the area. I think that those kinds of unique events have enough brand value for places and enough ego value for journalists that will continue. The thing that we tend to worry about in journalism is, what about the beat? What about the person who covers the town council or the federal agency and so on? Well, there, I think we are at a point where if you have one person covering your town at all, you're lucky these days. But that person should, I think, work in collaboration with the public. So an organization called City Bureau in Chicago has a program they call Documenters, where they train citizens to cover meetings, and they pay them for it so that they can have wide coverage. Now, you tie that with what we talked about earlier of recording those meetings, transcribing those meetings, making those meetings queryable. That doesn't do everything, but it handles some of the basics of saying what's happening to tax rates, are they banning books? It gives people the ability to maybe make a podcast out of the best parts of a school board meeting, to be able to ask questions of the transcript, and to alert the reporter to what they need to spend their time on more productively.
So a few small comments on that. The first one, a bit technical on the transcription part. If it's not a human doing it, but rather it's done automatically somehow, then the harder part, I think, is not the transcription, like figuring out which words were said, is the deorization, right? Who said what, right? Because if you don't have that information in the transcript, then the input to whatever the AI model is going to summarize is.
Right. So the human being is going to have to listen to the transcript for that moment. But rather than listening to the 3-hour meeting, if there was a 15-minute discussion of X, and there seems to be some controversy about that, then that's just simply more efficient for the reporter to just listen to those 15 minutes, or the citizen.
Yeah. But you can do that based on the audio recording. You don't actually have to be there.
No.
Right. So that's the other part. You can do that remotely if you have the recording, or if you want to make that deorization easier, then put the microphone in front of every speaker, and then you know which microphone the recording came from. But with regards to reporting of the beat, as you mentioned it, I'm looking at any recording of a press conference in Washington, D.C., and there's always 50 people taking photos. And again, I have to ask, what is the value of everybody past the first one? Why are they there?
I don't know. I testified before a Senate subcommittee about AI and journalism a few months ago. And there were 5 photographers there for I think a very important hearing, but to most people would be a very boring hearing. I'm a boring person. And they were taking pictures of me, with in front of the microphone and the whole thing, right? And I asked one of the guys, you're here on the side, it's a freelance thing. So he, on the chance that somebody's going to want a picture of that hearing or of that senator on that day, they pick up $20. One of the interesting things about illustration, though, is that I think if you looked at a newspaper 30, 40 years ago, before the web, I don't know, 10, 15% of stories were illustrated. But now on the internet, because of SEO, because of social, everything has to have an illustration for the card. And so that has increased, on the one hand, the market for illustration and for stock photos. But don't we know what AI is doing to stock photos? It's gonna shove that right back down as a marketplace. But again, I think there'll be more value for original photos. One of my favorite stories I tell in the Gutenberg parenthesis is what happened when the camera came, eliminating the jobs of illustrators. And when Lincoln was shot in Washington, Harper's sent illustrators to Washington so they could see the scene. By the time they got there on the train, he was dead. But they drew scenes, and they took the train back drawing on the way, and then came back and drew and engraved it. And I think it took 4 days or a week to get out the special edition, the extra. Well, the next thing that happened was, with the telegraph becoming more prevalent, they would send illustrators to an event to draw a drawing. They would then describe that illustration over the telegraph to an illustrator back in New York, who would draw it again and then engrave it. Then along comes the camera, and all that goes away because now you have images. And I think credible images, like credible reporting, will gain in value, but it's going to be hard to figure out how you find that credible stuff.
Yeah, I think that takes us down another rabbit hole, because I think we're just about to enter an era in which images cannot be trusted anymore.
Oh yeah.
Unless it was watermarked by the camera that took it, which no camera manufacturer is doing yet. I had a proposal out there for how it could be done technically, because I used to work in cameras for 15 years. But again, nobody seems to be doing that yet. And so right now,
look up something called Four Corners. There was a guy who used to be at the Center for International Center for Photography in New York, who proposed a structure for metadata around every image. Problem is that it's not just the camera that has to do that. It's the browser.
Why would that be so?
They've got to recognize that data, so they'll display that data.
Yeah, no, my proposal would be non-visual, right? So my proposal would be essentially that on the camera itself, you need to calculate the checksum, CRC of the image, and then you need to encrypt that using a private key that only camera manufacturers have. And the public keys for decrypting it and verifying it would be available to all journalists. So any journalist would be able to look at an image and figure out, is this the thing that came out of the camera, or has it been altered afterwards? You wouldn't be able to know anything else. But at the very least, you would know, is this made by Canon or by something after Canon, as an example. But this requires all the Canons and Nikons and the Pentaxes of the world to agree to embed this into every single image and video. And there's a higher chance of that happening than with US media because Japanese manufacturers are easier to coordinate. But still, it needs to happen. And until then, you can't trust any image that you see. I've been interviewed a few times, including on Fox News of all places, about how to tell the difference between fake images and real images. And 2 years ago, I had a very easy answer. Today, it's not that easy.
Well, all in all, I think it's going to come down to things like brands. Do you trust a given brand that somebody in Providence, this person says that they came out with this? I think we end up with more social systems. In the book coming out in the fall, The Web We Weave, I asked, what do people do before print? And I found this wonderful rabbit hole I went down. I went down for quite a while. Read 3 books on the topic called Fama, F-A-M-A, which means in Latin, it is said. And it was the structure for credibility before print. Again, print at first being unreliable because its provenance was unclear. But social status mattered. The innkeeper in town who talked to all the merchants who came through, who told a story, who cared about her credibility and knew who was true and who wasn't. Fama, which is the root of words like fame and infamy, good fama or bad fama would attach to a story, piece of information, to the teller, to the spreader, to the subject, and to the source. And so I think that, and by the way, fama was also seen in the name of a mythical beast that was in Virgil's Aeneid. I love this little part of the rabbit hole, where the beast would be as tall as the clouds and was covered completely in feathers. Every feather had eyes, ears, and mouth that never closed. It was an allegory for a rumor, right? And it watched over the city all day, and it could tell you truth. It could also tell you falsehood. Internet, that name is Fama. And so what it says is that people had to use social structures to understand where information came from and make judgment as to whether to follow it. That's where we're going to end up, I think, inevitably now.
And in some sense, fingerprints and images and videos and audio recording were all supposed to override that system. And we're going back to the Old Testament system of you need 2 witnesses to say it happened, right?
Yes, I think so. And I think that the technology is not the solution to the technology's problems. One thing I say in The Web We Weave is that I conclude that the internet is not a technology, it's a human network. And all the foibles most of the foibles we complain about are not matters of the technology or the technology companies even. There are problems that we brought to the internet. The internet didn't make us racist. This country was plenty racist before the internet. And if we turn it off tomorrow, it's not like we're all going to be fine again because we weren't ever fine. And we've got to recognize that as we try to tackle these issues.
Yeah, I think if we turn off the internet, we'll just find it harder for racists to find each other and band together, right? That's probably the only way in which it will affect things.
They'll work harder to find the ways. Is the problem.
I want to go back from this tangent to journalism, just because that's sort of the overarching theme. So we have investigative journalists. You said that will somehow still be funded because of prestige and Pulitzers and things like that.
To an extent.
Right. We have the beat reporters, which, I contend that from what we covered, that basically means 90% of it gets automated away. And maybe you need somebody to listen to a recording before figuring out which part to write about.
We can debate the percentage, but go ahead.
And then you have the pure writing, which we said there's 50 articles on a subject, 48 of them are rewriting the first 2. For the most part.
Writing just being a form of data visualization
right.
At the end.
And that is completely automatable. So the number of journalists that are still journalists at the end of this decade, that seems to sound like people tilling the soil in the 20s, right?
No, I actually don't think so. as if I did think so and I taught in journalism school, I'd be a terrible fraud. No, in the engagement journalism program, what we turned out was people who were, as much as anything else, about service and community and relationships than anything else. Yeah, they might write stories and they know how to report, but in the engagement journalism program that Carrie Brown and I started, we both now left the school and will be doing these things elsewhere. But the idea was that students worked with one community the whole time they were in the program. And they had to listen to that community, understand the community's needs, reflect their understanding back, then figure out how to help people do what they needed to do. And that might take the form of articles, but it might not. It might take the form of advice, of convening people together, of being a liaison to people who experts or people in power, of enabling the community to share the information they already have among themselves, of creating databases, of creating tools, of educating people. These are all things that to me are core to the mission of journalism, but may not end up producing the form of journalism as we knew it.
So I want all these things to happen, but until now, everything journalists did was monetized as content at the end. If the demand for content remains roughly what it is or morphs in some predictable way, right? And most of that does not require the things that you just said, or it does not require that to be multiplied 10x, right? So 90% of journalists don't do what journalists are doing today. They shift to this model that you just described. How does that model get monetized? How do they get paid?
I have no guaranteed answer. I'll admit that going in, but I think that there's various structures. I think that if you look at the public radio model in the US and you look at the Guardian's model in the UK, patronage takes you part of the way. There isn't enough charity to support all the journalism we need, but there is some level of charity to start with from individuals, from foundations, from rich individuals, with the caution about the influence they might have.
So I'm guessing your opinion of Jeff Bezos owning the Post is not the same as everybody else's in journalism.
I think that Jeff Bezos has actually been a fairly good steward. And if you read Marty Baron's book, the former editor of the Post, I think it only bolsters that conclusion. However, I think that other rich people, Patrick Soon-Shiong in LA was a naive buyer of the LA Times who thought it was easy and now has learned it is not. And hedge funds are responsible for ruining most of American newspapers. And Rupert Murdoch is responsible for ruining much of English language journalism around the world. So no, I'm not necessarily in favor of moguls taking over, but I am saying there is some level of support there. There is also going to be some level of paywalls. I think that the fact that everybody thinks they can have a paywall is foolish. Not everybody's the New York Times. It's not going to work, but there'll be some uniquely valuable content or fresh content that can survive that way. Then there's other kinds of subsidies, holding events, selling ancillary products, commerce to an extent. It's going to be a mix, but we're going to have to be a hell of a lot more efficient than we were. Again, we can't afford to have everybody rewriting BuzzFeed's dress story. We have to do something that's unique and valuable and in the community. There are models out there. There's a company called Village Media in Canada that has, I think, covers 29 fairly small markets there. It's Canada, so everything's small, except Toronto and Montreal. That was a Canadian joke. I don't mean that.
Yeah, Vancouver is pretty big too. Apologize, Vancouver.
Yes, exactly. And Saskatoon, still pretty small. But Jeff Elgie, who runs it, has done a very good job. He's profitable. He tells me that he needs about $500,000 to start a market and is profitable within a year. I mentioned earlier, Lookout Santa Cruz, started by Ken Doctor, who's a well-known analyst of the news business for many, many years. Now, he raised a lot of money. He raised, I think, $3.5 million in Santa Cruz. He's trying to raise $5 million to move into a next market in Oregon. But he has a staff of, I think, 14 versus maybe 4 on the competitive hedge fund newspaper in Santa Cruz. And again, he just won a Pulitzer because they did good work. They're supported by local advertising because local advertisers still, they're not as many as there used to be. They're too facing competition, but they too care about the community and want to have relationships with the community. So I think that there are ways to support a good deal of journalism. How much is enough? I don't know.
Yeah, I keep thinking back to the analogy of the 1920s and the mechanization of agriculture, right? some number of people still working the fields were supported past 1930, right? But it was at about 10% of what we had in 1920. And 90% were essentially forced to migrate out of the region because there was just nothing else to do for them there. So how do you avoid the same thing in white collar jobs where the output is words, essentially?
I don't know, but I'm researching a book right now. I'm starting to write a book right now about the history of the linotype. Again, that was the machine. Unfortunately, people under a certain age have no idea what that is, which is going to make it hard to sell the book. The linotype is this, if you Google it, it's a magnificent Rube Goldberg contraption. It's this huge thing, taller than a human being, that operated to produce type at unbelievable speed in molded hot lead. It was the last gasp of the Gutenberg age, and I love this machine. It's just amazing. Anyway, the story I was going to tell was that the International Typographical Union, the people who set type one letter at a time, were disturbed by the coming machine, but they recognized that it was inevitable. And they had two choices. They could act like the Luddites and destroy them. That would work for a little while, not very long. Or they decided instead to demand to control the machine. And by the way, this is amazing to me, but because type was set one letter at a time for 500 years, it turned into a spectator sport at the very end. Believe it or not, speed typesetting, they were called the Swifts, would travel around city to city. People paid to come watch type being set. Now, interestingly, the International Typographical Union then forbade that to continue because they didn't want a man versus machine contest where their men, and they were men, would lose. So along comes the typesetting machine. There were many attempts to do it. One of them bankrupted Mark Twain when he tried to compete. The linotype won in the end, and then another machine called the monotype. And the ITU said, well, okay, this thing is inevitable. We have to take it over. We have to be in charge of it. We have to be the ones to work with this and know it. And their jobs went down for a while, indeed. But they knew what would happen. They knew because of the increased efficiency that the field would explode, and it did. And 20 years later, they had far more jobs than they had when the machine arrived. So it was a strategic, smart thing to do. And that worked really well from the 1890s until the 1960s. Then came along something called cold type, which was, rather than molding type out of lead, you shot light through a clear letter on a black band onto photographic paper, and that's how type was made. And you cut it up and you put it on pages with wax, and you then photographed the whole page. That was called cold type before there was PostScript, and before letters became shapes that computers could interpret. So in cold type, the ITU realized again that they were doomed, but this time they acted like Luddites. This time they fought it. They tried to stop it. They tried to get lifetime job guarantees. And there was a huge and horrible strike in New York that killed 6 of 9 newspapers and the ITU with it. So what's the lesson there? The lesson, I think, for these fields is to recognize the inevitability of the technology arriving, and that businesses are going to try to embrace it to save money. But what unique skills do we have? This is again why I think that news companies should create APIs to make it easier for AI companies to get their information, but to do it in such a way that they have control over some level of that negotiation and to support their work. I think that's possible. It's what's happening in the Nordics. Again, it ain't happening in the US and places like Germany.
For what it's worth, I think people my age think linotype is the part of a font in Microsoft's font suite. Palatino linotype. That's all we know. All right, last question. You know what I do for a living. We're a public benefit corporation. We're trying to do things right and not just make money. What advice would you have for me for how to try to actually improve the ecosystem with the use of AI?
Another great question, and this is, again, how I buy time to find an answer. I think that the more you see yourself as Harpers of 1850, recognizing that there's good stuff out there, that it's all the more difficult every day to find who is authoritative and who has quality and who has done original work and who is expert or experienced. You're right. That is the hard work. That curation is the hard work. And that, I think, is where there is value. Point one. Point two, I don't think it's one size fits all. And I know you recognize that in Otherweb in the sense that I can go and I can pick topics that interest me. But I think there's another more nuanced layer to this as well that probably goes to fama and social recommendation. And we saw it briefly in Twitter Blue before Musk ruined every goddamn thing he touches. And we see it in Blue Sky, where I can pick my algorithm. I can pick the view of the web that I want based not just on topic and a taxonomy of topics, but also based on the relationships that I have and the views that I have and who do I trust. And I think there's a way to bring back a bit of social value, which has now been lost, especially around news. Now that Meta is giving up on news, TikTok might go away, God help us. And so social, in a sense, is leaving news. I think there's an opportunity to combine not just AI, but also social again with news and enable people to follow those who do a good job of curating manually. So it's not just that you do it and the AI does it. If I have a way to say, I find the good stuff around AI coverage. I mean, every week I'm on podcasts called This Week in Google and AI Inside. As a result, I read a lot of news around technology. I put them on the rundown for the podcast so we can talk about them. And well, so I'm pretty good at finding the stuff. There's other people out there who do the same thing, who are links, the old link blog view. Maybe there's some germ of something there, the Harpers of 1850, to find the best stuff. So I think that there's that combination of finding authority and finding those who have taste and good sense and finding ways to put them together will still support quality in the end, because I think we'll want quality.
Taste and good sense. I'd like to end with that thought because it's sorely lacking lately.
Let's hope. God's work, my friend. God's work.
Professor, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Alex.
This has been another episode of The Otherweb. Join us next time for more discussions of news, media, and everything in between.